Hi and welcome everyone. We're going to get started. If we could ask everybody to keep their phones on mute until they're talking or asking questions, that would be great. So we look forward to our meeting today. This is our April 2021 Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance meeting. And it's going to run today from about 3:30 to 5:30, and we'll have time at the end for everybody to ask questions. But in the interim, you can always put questions through the chat box. Next slide, Allison. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to do a general welcome to the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance for those of you that are new. We're going to go over some housekeeping and some continuing education credits. We offer credits not just from a legal perspective, but also from a technical perspective. Then we're going to get into our very, very exciting program about due diligence on cyber and IT issues in M&A context. And at the end, we'll leave some time for Q&A and networking. Next slide, please. And if everybody could put their phones on mute, we would appreciate it. I hear some background noise. Thank you. So for those of you who have just joined, what the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance is a multidisciplinary group. And really what we do is we try to meet every other month and really hit some of the hot topics in the cybersecurity space. But we don't just address them from a legal perspective or an IT technical perspective or a risk perspective. We try to bring them all together to really give the best answer. This organization has been around for many years now. We are a nonprofit. If you want to know more information about us, you can go to our website where you can sign up to receive other types of communications as well through the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. And for anyone that wants to get more involved in this organization, please let me know. We have tons of volunteer opportunities. We really just do this out of the goodness of our hearts. If anybody is ever interested in helping us do grant-related work or working with scholarships or anything to further cybersecurity, please reach out to me and we would love to have you join the team. Next slide, please. So now Allison is going to go over just some of the housekeeping rules and some information on CLE. Allison, we can't hear you very well.
Are you able to hear me now?
Barely.
Okay, I'll speak up. For those who have previously attended an MCSA meeting, we have been recording the sessions so that folks have access to the on-demand playback files, and those are posted to the MCSA website behind the member login. So if you are interested in seeing a copy of the playback after the program, you'll just need to either be an existing MCSA member and log into the website, or you can use the link on the previous slide to sign up for free. So just wanted to give everyone a heads up that we are recording today's program. In terms of a couple other housekeeping notes, as Jen has mentioned, if you could kindly keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. We'll open it up at the end of the program for the Q&A and networking so that we can see and hear everyone. But until then, just to minimize interruptions to the speakers, please kindly stay on mute. There are a couple of widgets you can use within MS Teams if you've not used the platform before. You can use the Show Conversation button, which is the little speech bubble button, to open up the team chat. You could also use the Show Participants button to take a look at who's all on the meeting. And then if you have a question, when we get to the Q&A portion, there's a sort of a raise your hand function up at the top as well that you can use to raise your hand. And then again, if you have any technical difficulties, first try refreshing your browser. And if that does not work, try exiting the Teams meeting and then rejoining through the join link. And then as far as continuing education credits go, we do offer two types, as Jen mentioned. We have continuing legal education credits for those individuals attending today who are licensed attorneys and would like credit towards their relicensure. I will provide a couple of links in the meeting chat box that link to an attorney affirmation form. Anyone who is looking to receive credit will need to submit that attorney affirmation form back to me at the end of the program, including recording a couple of CLE course codes that we will announce during the program today. And then we do also offer continuing privacy education in a self-reporting fashion for ISACA certified individuals as well. So again, I'll provide the link to that form for self-reporting. It's also linked in the copy of the slide deck as well. If there are any questions regarding the CE side of things, whether it's the legal or the privacy education, feel free to contact me at any point. And I'll turn it right back over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Allison. So as always, I wanted to show you that and offer up to you that Foley does offer a free state data breach notification chart. This is available online, and we always recommend the online form because we update this periodically through the year. Next slide, please. Essentially what this chart does, if you click on it, you can see each state data breach law's requirements by simply clicking on the state. Thank you, Allison. And this is just an example of Wisconsin. We just bring this up because we get a lot of questions about it. It's completely free. You can Google it. Just make sure that you have the most recent version and that I think the last version we have is December 2020. With that said, we always do a little bit of updates on changing laws. This is the security space, and as many of you are well familiar with, there's laws in all the different various states now on security. What we're seeing now is that also happening on the privacy side. In our last session, we covered some of the developments with California's privacy law, CCPA, and what is going to be changed under their new initiative, CPRA. Since that time, there's other states that have enacted laws, such as in Virginia and others, and we predict that privacy is going to be somewhat similar to security unless we get a federal privacy law in place. And so eventually we will probably have a similar chart, such as what you are seeing here, on the privacy side. But in the interim, this is a great chart to use, and I just want you to be aware that it is available out there. Next slide, please. So some other new updates. I wanted to introduce a new member, and he was going to attend our call today, but he's in an emergency matter, a cyber matter. We have a new member here at Foley to our team that I thought maybe some of you would be interested in. His name is Matt Kruger, and he is a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. He has multiple different skills in various different areas, but he does have cybersecurity experience when he was working with the government. He's also worked a lot with the FBI, et cetera, on cybersecurity matters. So I wanted to let you all know we have that new team member. Next slide, please. And then something I wanted to just let you all be aware of. We, as an organization, have done a lot of partnership with a Michigan similar organization to ours, and we intend to do more collaboration as well in the future. And I just wanted to bring up that they're starting an initiative, and what they are is the Michigan Healthcare Cybersecurity Council, and they're creating this initiative with a company called MindView. Next slide, please, Allison. And what they're doing is there's a grant that is out there to really help address mental health and wellness of really the impacts of COVID-19 on healthcare providers, in particular first responders. And it is, a mobile app, and they're trying to get this off the ground through their initiative in Michigan. And so I just want to do a quick announcement for, any healthcare organizations, that have any interest in this. Please let me know. And there is grant funding available. We can connect you with the leads in Michigan, and we're thinking about doing a really a co-grant opportunity here and bringing this to Wisconsin as well. We're also thinking that, maybe perhaps this is not even limited just to the healthcare sector. Frankly, all of us that are in the data breach response business, especially of late, we've just seen a complete increase in cybersecurity attacks that are occurring. I don't know about you all, but I work 24/7 as of late. So maybe this is something we should consider for our own group on wellness for IT CISOs and others in the business. But we just wanted to put that out there to anybody that would have an interest in this potential grant or be interested in working with the Michigan Cybersecurity Alliance. Please reach out and let me know. Next slide, please. So now on to our program today. What we're going to focus on are best practices for cybersecurity and IT due diligence engagements. And I cannot tell you that I could not be more excited to talk about this topic because I have watched this evolve over the past couple of years. And in my personal opinion, I do not believe enough due diligence is done, in particular on targets in this space. We as lawyers now are getting involved more than ever in deals. And from a legal perspective, we certainly ask a lot of data, cyber and privacy related questions or IT related software questions when we go through the due diligence process. But we are not only unable to really evaluate IT integration issues very fully because we're a law firm, but we often see that that aspect is not done very well through the process, and thus the ultimate buyer is left with a mess on their hands post-closing. And I will highlight a few relevant examples. One recent example, we have a client just recently acquired a company, hadn't even transitioned yet. The company they just acquired had a massive breach. Our client did not, even have the opportunity to really learn the target's new systems. Really didn't have a chance to do due diligence and really get in and see what their cybersecurity practices were before acquisition. And really, the acquired company had a very different security posture than the buyer. And so the buyer itself had fantastic security policies and procedures and practices. And unfortunately, the breach just happened before they were able to integrate in and caused a huge issue. Another recent example was, a company oftentimes in deals, rep and warranty insurance is relied upon, as a backstop. We had a client purchase a company that turned out to not be as good as it claimed it was. In fact, had major IT, integration issues and really just had functionality issues in addition to cybersecurity issues, and ended up, really shutting down that company once they came in. Some other points, we most definitely know that cyber attackers are clearly sophisticated and they plan ahead for a couple things. One, they project what larger companies are eventually going to acquire and sit and wait in those smaller companies for acquisition. I also do believe that somehow many cyber attackers that are more sophisticated understand what deals are happening and perhaps are predatory when they know that that company is transitioning in. One other point on this, and I literally could go on for days, but I will keep my comments to a minimum because we're going to go into the weeds momentarily. But the other issue I'm seeing is for companies that are being acquired, there is a lot more emphasis on data privacy and security, rightfully so. But I see companies having to get their data privacy and security programs up to speed and or from beginning to finish within weeks to be able to answer questions for acquisition reasons. Clearly, this is not something that anybody wants to do nowadays within a week or two. And logistically, it is almost physically impossible to do that, even with putting a lot of efforts in. So in sum, this is a really critical area for deals and due diligence. And next slide, please, Allison. Our co-sponsors here today are Sikich. They do a lot of work in this space. They are on the IT technical side. And next slide, please, Allison. I look so much forward to having them talk about the things they can do, because really, in addition to doing legal due diligence, many deals really need to have a layer of IT security or just an IT review to make sure that once that company is acquired, it really can function and be integrated into the buyer's environment. And as I said before, oftentimes this is not thought about until after post-acquisition. And also, you really should be doing some sort of cybersecurity review of that organization. In fact, maybe even doing some external pen testing to make sure that you're not acquiring a huge, big risk. And that delicate time post-closing is really essential to make sure that you're covered. So with all that said, could not be more excited to talk about this. It's a very relevant issue. And I'm now going to turn it over to Brad and Kevin to do a little introduction about themselves and get started. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. So my name is Brad Lutgen. I lead the cybersecurity practice at Sikich, one of the partners in our IT group. Sikich overall is a large professional services organization. We're really unique in that over half of our revenue, though, comes from IT and various IT services, one of which is the cybersecurity practice that I lead. So I'll turn it over to Kevin to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Brad. Kevin Bong. I lead the penetration testing and incident response group here at Sikich. Been doing that for about 6 years, the consulting thing for probably 12. Worked for Johnson Bank. Many of you probably regionally know them for a number of years before that. Wore a bunch of hats, and definitely all those different hats feed into the variety of different things we see in these forensic engagement and due diligence engagements. You're getting a taste of kind of every part of IT when you start diving into these topics.
So I think we want to start out by looking at what we would consider more the traditional due diligence that has been done for years in a lot of cases. Sikich itself has an entire group called Transaction Advisory Services. Cybersecurity is a key component of that, but we do a lot of things that are here as well, including the financial piece. That's what you're used to seeing, where we're going to look at your books. We're going to do what's called a quality of earnings assessment, where we're going to go in and verify inventory quantities and talk to customers and review customer contracts and make sure that things are on the up and up from an overall financial standpoint. Makes sense, key part of doing due diligence. Now you also have the legal side of the table. Jen talked on it a little bit previously, but looking at what are those contracts, what are the third-party obligations that the company has, and when even from a security standpoint, that's been added a little bit more recently, but looking into the various compliance requirements and things that are there, at least from a Q&A standpoint, what do you have for policies, procedures, all of those type of things. And then probably in the past, I'd say 20 to 30 years, there's been some basic IT due diligence, but when we look at that, it really tended to focus on more licensing requirements. Are you under any sort of liability from Microsoft because you're not properly licensed? Maybe a system inventory and component inventory to try to give an idea of where systems are at or how dated they may be. So, not really digging into the risk-based side of things, which is where we tend to look at on the cybersecurity front. Kevin, anything to add on that?
Not on this slide. So, next slide. Yeah, but certainly there's been a lot of changes, and the key one is the grossest security breaches. And I think it's interesting. We really seem like we're at the like a perfect storm, especially for these ransomware attacks. The availability of like digital currencies so that attackers can now get 6-7 figure ransoms almost instantly, almost anonymously, has made every type of industry a target. And so even like a small manufacturer who's a good target as for acquisition is also now a good target for these attackers who through one weekend's work can take over that small manufacturer's network and encrypt enough systems to get $100,000 payoff or even a $500,000 payoff, just like that.
Yeah, I mean, we just worked a case where it was a small restaurant group, kind of a small restaurant franchise group, 13 restaurants, and their ransomware ask was just shy of $1 million. I think it was 976,000 when he did the Bitcoin conversion. So those numbers are definitely getting high, and they're not shy for what they're asking for. And at this point, they're anticipating negotiation as part of that process. So, they're utilizing the art of the deal where they ask high and settle somewhere lower, but it's certainly increasing on a regular basis. I think what's important here is that when you look at where technology has come, even organizations that traditionally might have been manufacturing focused are becoming more and more technologically savvy. So they've got their IP, which is bringing value to that organization, tied up into processes and procedures that may be unique to them. Or you look at organizations that exist now where everything that they're doing is application or internet based, and that obviously presents great opportunity but significant risk as well. And from the compliance piece, Jen mentioned some of the privacy laws. Those are ever changing. You've got new things being introduced to the market now with CMMC, for example, for manufacturers. Obviously, we've had HIPAA high trust compliance regulations for quite some time. PCI, all of those areas that bring additional liability when you're acquiring an organization that's subjected to those compliance regulations that you're going to want to make sure that they're meeting, as well as from the third-party contractual obligations that we have here. What we found in a recent case that we worked was that an organization, purchased another, and once they got into the weeds of rolling them in, found out that the organization they were buying had actually made promises to customers for key functionality of a tool that they had developed within their contracts that they never built. So now all of a sudden there was liability there for the purchaser, whereas there's unfulfilled contracts that bring up issues they weren't expecting when they made the purchase and didn't do the full due diligence.
So that's what kind of drives kind of a different need and a different look for how we approach kind of due diligence, specifically cybersecurity due diligence before the sale, kind of ramping up to the transaction. It needs to be across the board, looking at the staff, those compliance recommendations or considerations. Software development definitely is getting ramped up into that. And more often, the underwriting, the rep and warranty is also driving that. We've had organizations that have had to kind of remediate, have the target remediate things before the rep and warranty insurance would be willing to cover, or things like that. And those were all things that were identified as part of this IT due diligence.
Yeah, I think that as Jen mentioned earlier, there's that backstop of this rep and warranty insurance. So I think in the past, a deep dive wasn't always taken into some of these areas because people felt, well, if it turns out it's not as we thought it was, we'll file a rep and warranty claim. But as Kevin mentioned, it's now to the point in a lot of deals where we're helping with due diligence, where the rep and warranty insurance underwriter is going through and interviewing us on our results and what we found as part of the underwriting process, and as Kevin mentioned, actually forcing remediation on certain things before they issue the policy. So keep that in mind as you're looking to do these things, because we've seen that actually delay timelines on deals, to get that across the finish line to complete that.
Yeah, definitely rep and warranty insurance has become more commonplace for sure. And, they're driving a lot of these questions because they're underwriting the deal. And so not only have we seen a lot more rep and warranty insurance interviews, requests, just as you said, but now we're dealing with a fair amount of claims on the back end for submission of why the reps and warranties, were not met. And now we have to come to claims. In fact, Sikich has handled some issues for us on that side as well.
Yeah, and from the strategic standpoint, I mean, it's the key is you're needing to look at risk. So I think in the past, a lot of IT due diligence has been very matter of fact. Here is the details of again, systems, components, things along those lines. And when you're looking at cybersecurity, we all talk about risk, and all of us that are in cybersecurity of taking risk-based approach to things to make smart decisions around things. And the due diligence process is no different because now you're categorizing risk and you're prioritizing risk of what this acquisition means to an organization. So you don't want to, even just focus on the remediation costs of, okay, to fix this individual thing. You really need to look kind of long term. And as we dig into some additional slides here, it's kind of important to point out, and we have a slide that focuses on it later on in the presentation, but a lot of variables apply to deals. So what we're going to go through and talk about next and kind of what we say is best practices, none of it applies to every deal. So again, buying a company who does custom software development, completely different than buying a manufacturer that makes widgets, or a tuck-in for a new piece of functionality that you want to offer to a business. Completely different due diligence process than working with a private equity group who's rolling up 3 organizations into one new one. So we have to look at all of those components when we select. So some of the things we're talking about here, I just want to preface with that you're going to look at it and say, well, that might not be applicable to me. Very much understood. When we sit down and we go through the due diligence process, we have literally a laundry list of 20 or 25 different kind of line item services that we go through with our client and then say, okay, which maybe 10 to 15 of these are applicable to this deal, just based on how it's set up.
So yeah, and in this slide, I have my favorite story around this one, and it's kind of a favorite story because we see it in so many different of these due diligence engagements. Is a recent situation. The buyer was a big corporate entity, hundreds of employees, hundreds of PCs that all look the same, all part of Active Directory. All managed and patched through kind of traditional tools, servers on site, and kind of, the old guard IT staff with gray hair that kind of know what's up. And then the target, the seller, was very much a startup culture, and that's what you see a lot of times is that's what the seller looks like. And in that startup culture, we're seeing things like no office at all, or if it's an office, it's like a WeWork office where it's, just log in and find a desk and some Wi-Fi. No servers and things like that. Like everything we do, like everything literally we do is in the cloud. And so we've got dozens of cloud services instead. They're not even workstations are a mix of Macs and PCs. And we've even seen situations where it's like, yeah, we have them direct ship from Best Buy to the new employee and they configure their own workstation. And so when you start to discuss this with the buyer and you're getting together with the buyer's IT staff, they're freaking out because they see something that's so different than what they're used to. And for them, different is bad. And a big part of what we're coming in is trying to figure out, well, what of the different is bad and what of the different is just different? If you first hear, oh yeah, they're not part of Active Directory and all these machines just, are everyone's work from home, your IT staff panics. Well, how do they manage them? How do they secure them? How do they patch them? Well, they're using cloud services. They've got a cloud service that does central patching and central antivirus and central, whatever management. And there's ways in that startup model to do it right, where you've got basically a similar level of security control, but done in a different or less traditional method. And that's where a lot of this kind of IT strategy stuff comes in, is trying to pick out what that the seller is doing, what the target is doing is a concern or a risk, and what is okay, or at least okay until you are able to convert them. You know, and that drives a lot of the then follow-up conversations of what is your conversion plan and how quickly are you going to convert them to your corporate norm, and is there even a desire to do that? You know, in the situation I was just talking about, there was a strong desire from like leadership at the buyer to say, hey, this startup company we're buying, we want them to be part of us, but we don't want to change their way of doing things because they're being very successful. We don't want to go in and screw that up. So bring them into the fold, but at the same time, don't change anything. And you can imagine the types of IT challenges that kind of request or approach brings about.
Yeah, that's where the strategic approach comes in, and there really shouldn't be a cookie cutter approach to good due diligence, because again, you have to sit down and understand, what are the goals. We do have another deal that we worked where, a private equity group that we've worked with before came to us and said, we want you to do due diligence on this acquisition we're making. Well, we started chatting with them and essentially almost talked ourselves out of a job because they were really buying them and scrapping everything IT related the second the deal was done. So there wasn't a lot for us to look at for as far as existing systems, other than just a little bit of diligence to make sure there wasn't anything egregious or, potential indicators of compromise that, could come back to bite them. But, it's understanding that strategic focus of what's happening so that then we can customize that due diligence around that. The other thing we see that's common from kind of the general IT side, and again, depending on the organization, is legacy ERP. One of the things that Sikich is experts at is we've got a very large ERP practice, and we find that we'll include them in some of the due diligence work because organizations will have a homegrown ERP system that has a lot of sensitive data in it, and that data might not be encrypted, might not be stored properly because it was homegrown, or as we know, ERPs are expensive and complicated, and people will put off replacing them for years and years and years. So we'll find out somebody's running on a legacy ERP system that's 20 years old and hasn't been patched or is no longer supported or updated. So additional kind of key area that we want to hone in on is some of those business systems when we're looking at kind of the general IT side of things.
Next, yeah. Yeah, and then the next big thing we're looking into is compliance issues. Great story here, working with an organization. A large e-commerce software development firm was buying a small e-commerce software development firm. And one of the questions to the seller was, do you store any customer data on workstations, any sensitive data on workstations, on developer workstations or anything like that? And the answer was no. We have policies against that. That doesn't happen. But through our diligence, to take that to the next level and, okay, well, I want to sit down and talk to your developers and talk about their processes. And so we asked the question, okay, you've got customer data in the production site. Where do you do your development? Well, we do it on this dev site. But some developers also do it on their workstations. Okay, well, do you replicate from production to that development site? Yeah, we do that. But then we have the script we run that anonymizes the data. Okay, well, let's talk through that. So you're migrating live data, from production to these dev environments or to these laptops. And in digging into that, we kind of know the questions to ask, the tricks, the things that people are typically doing because we see it over and over again. And in this case, the questions to ask and the tricks that they were doing was, well, how do you get that data from dev to prod? Oh, well, we export it. Okay, what do you do with that export file? How are you sure that it's deleted and not put any place unsafe as you're moving it over to the laptop? And then, tell me about the script you're running. How do you ensure that somebody actually runs that script? Well, we tell them to run it, but we have no way to double check on that. So, in that situation, found out that while the first question said, no, there's no PII on developer workstations, diving into it, it turned out there certainly was, processes that ended up with PII kind of floating around on these developer workstations.
Yeah, I think if you look at a lot of, again, different types of M&A, so you look at a larger organization, going after a smaller, tuck-in type, organization, maybe 5 to 15 million, those type of, you know, startups or smaller businesses are never really looking for ways to spend money. So we'll see that a lot of times they'll they'll have compliance requirements that they don't even know they have or have kind of buried or not paid attention to. So, part of our goal is to try to find those things through interview processes, mapping sensitive data. What do they have? What's applicable to them? And as Kevin mentioned, how's it being stored? What are they doing with it? Are all key things. And then if they do have certain compliance requirements. Kevin is actually working on one just recently where an organization has a high trust certification. Actually, the organization that's being acquired has the high trust certification. So then you want to look and say, okay, the larger company acquiring them is concerned of what does that mean? If we bring them into the fold, what happens to that certification? How do we not mess up some of the segmentation they have and their controls and policies so that, if they've got value in this high trust certification, we don't want to mess that up, but we also don't want to now apply it to our, $200 million organization, when we may not need to. So we got to look at all of those things again from that strategic approach and, from the integration standpoint, what does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah, and as a good example of kind of that, either they don't know their compliance requirements or are kind of trying to hide them. Another recent project like this, the seller had said as part of the diligence discovery, yeah, we're PCI compliant. Here's the report of that. And what they provided was a report of kind of an automated scan from their bank and like the PCI compliance that a typical like merchant would do. But it turned out that this organization, they weren't a merchant, they were a PCI service provider. They did web hosting for other organizations and other things like that. And and as part of the diligence, we were able to find, okay, here's the activities you're doing. They don't align with the PCI compliance information you've provided. You actually are falling short of your PCI obligations because of the nature of the work that you do. And again, made the seller or the buyer aware of that, and that made them take some pretty substantial steps, kind of remediation wise before proceeding with the sale, because the buyer definitely didn't want to again bring on that risk of PCI non-compliance and potentially making the buyer themselves PCI non-compliant at that point.
Yeah, that's a large investment when you look at somebody who's, only done a basic SAQ and some scans compared to, undergoing a full third-party assessment for all of the PCI controls. Obviously, probably $50,000 audit alone, plus all the remediation of it. So had that not been identified and found post-close, all of a sudden, the new organization is taking on a lot of remediation that, somebody going through their first time PCI audit as a service provider, maybe re-architecting huge areas of their network, and, doing a lot of work, which also equates to a lot of cost. So definitely something that can impact the overall valuation on a deal if not taken care of ahead of time.
Next slide. And so, yeah, on top of that kind of compliance, the next key thing we're really pushing for is the security testing. Like, what is the posture of that target? Jen had brought up at the beginning, the situation of a breach happening shortly after the sale. And we've even seen them, we call it buying a breach, where after the sale, you find evidence of a breach that happened before the sale. We've had, more than one forensic engagement that was just that type of situation. And
I'm zooming in on that because a lot of times in deals, they'll only want to guarantee certain things for like a year. And we all know, on average, it's around over 200 days plus potentially before you find a breach. And so I've had numerous incidents where the cause of the breach originated many, many years ago through an acquisition. And so I definitely recommend that is not acceptable language to carve out, at least on the breach side, because we in the business know those don't arise right away. Like my former situation, it arose too soon, with a breach, but often on the other side, it takes a long time to discover, those issues in acquired systems because, usually they don't roll over right away. There's some sort of transitionary period, after the deal is done. So I could not agree more on that end.
Yep. Yeah. And so there's two approaches we take to that as part of the due diligence. The first side is here, the security testing. What is your posture? And then we'll talk a bit about some forensic investigation side on a future slide. But here, focusing on the security testing, obviously the goal here is to look at that target and determine what is their posture, what is their maturity, do they have some significant weaknesses that the buyer needs to be aware of. A good example is we were part of our security testing just by default is an external vulnerability scan and an external pen test. And in part of recent testing, we identified a client target that was running a Fortinet firewall. 2018 was its last patch, and there's a vulnerability in that Fortinet firewall that was patched in 2018, but it was just kind of under the radar and people don't know about it. And it turns out in a lot of configurations, you can use that vulnerability to pull passwords and user IDs from that firewall, from its memory. And so as part of our testing, like we said, hey, here's your firewall. It hasn't been patched and it's got this vulnerability. And here's a list of, your employees who are logged into it right now and some logins from like foreign IPs that are logged into it right now. So that security testing really does, even from the internet, the external testing, pretty effective at saying what is your external posture and what are those risks and bringing them to light. Ideally, though it's a bit harder, we also really push for what we call an internal penetration test, where we're going to simulate not just an attack from the internet, but an attack that has already gotten a foothold on the internal network, maybe through an infected PC, maybe through a phishing attack or something like that. But the amount of information you can get from an internal test like that is so much greater because we'll be able to see that internal posture. Are they patching internally? Have they hardened systems? Have they gotten rid of defaults? Or even potentially find avenues for attack that may have been compromised. So it's really great if we can get that to happen. That's one of the more challenging things to make happen during one of these due diligence engagements, because as you can imagine, like what is the right time and how do you go about talking someone into a pen test in the middle of when they're, in the middle of the sale, and maybe not all the employees are even aware of the sale yet because it hasn't happened yet.
But I think that comes
Things
to,
like that.
yeah, I think it comes full circle to why we wanted to do the presentation in the first place, is to, make folks on the call aware of this type of testing and the importance of everything we're talking about here. Because when you're executing an LOI, a letter of intent to do purchase on either side, and you're going to outline what the terms are for due diligence, both timeframes and what that's going to include, there's ways that we can do this testing and do it a little bit under the radar. So typically what we find is you've got someone at the executive level in IT that is actively involved in the transaction, who's familiar with what's going on, perhaps a CIO or a CISO who, knows the company's being sold, bought, whatever it may be. And in that case, we can work through that person in essentially a covert manner. So if we want to do the internal testing, a lot of times that, leader can say to his team, hey, look, I've hired Sikich to do an internal pen test. And then we may need access to other internal staff to carry out the pen test. But we can be transparent to say, we're doing it for that organization, not as part of any due diligence, just as the fact that, we were hired to do a pen test and, please give your cooperation, help us set up the systems we need, et cetera. As long as, again, that's talked about ahead of time and, some of those expectations are set. But there's definitely a lot of value there. And I think that that's a key way that, we want to look at making sure that this is included in, again, some of the outline of what's expected during due diligence.
Can you guys talk a little bit about, so you go in and do a pen test, you report that obviously to the buyer, but, vis-a-vis the target, I mean, you now know they have a vulnerability. So, how have you handled that from a practical perspective, when you guys have gotten involved?
That's a great question. We've had, it a lot depends on the relationship between seller and buyer and kind of how much information is getting exchanged. We only give our penetration test report to the buyer, and then we kind of coordinate with them about what and how we're going to notify the seller. We definitely really push hard to make sure that what is found, especially if it's risky, gets communicated to the seller kind of as quickly as possible, because we hate to Sikich know about a problem and not let that entity not know about it.
And usually we'll have some contractual obligations even with the seller, because from our end, our direct, we may be getting paid by the buyer for due diligence. We may be getting engaged through the buyer or through their attorney in a lot of cases. However, we're still essentially hacking into systems that are owned by the seller. So we'll still have terms and such executed with the seller. And then, like Kevin said, depending on the relationship to that point between the parties, sometimes dictates what those terms include. So, I mean, we have seen it where the seller's requested a copy of the report and the buyer's been okay with that. But typically our first answer is to the buyer because they're paying the bill, obviously.
Yeah, I was just wondering how that practically works out, because I think that would be extremely useful. I mean, at least it gives some sort of slight reassurance. Do you know what I mean? During that transitionary period, that there's not a large major gap or hole, from the pen test report. So I couldn't recommend that enough.
Right, and some of it's based on the severity of what we find. I mean, we do the same thing on our standard pen test as part of our own methodology for our practice, even when it's not due diligence. If we find something egregious enough, we scream from the rooftops and notify a client immediately. It doesn't wait to get put in a report. For that same reason, Jen, right? You find something, you want to let them know right away so they can approach it and hopefully fix it.
Yeah. Interesting and highly recommended. I wish everybody would do that.
And actually, as part of that, we put together the pen test findings as a typical penetration test report. But kind of as an optional thing we've been doing on a lot of these is in parallel with the due diligence security testing, we're putting together recommendations around integration considerations. So we see a lot of things that like, okay, that could be a problem during integration, or, this is our recommendation for how to handle this. But the penetration test findings really feed into that as well. Our integration considerations document is actually laid out like, here's some integration considerations, pre-sale. You should ask the seller to remediate this pen test finding before the sale, and we'll list those things that are highly critical there. And then, immediately upon the sale, here's some risks that were identified maybe by the pen test that you should work to remediate yourself through your own tools. They don't have good patching, and if they're not going to fix it, you need to fix it right away, that kind of thing. And then laying those out in a timeline. So it's not just a big pile of, here's all the issues we found, but baking those into what do you have to worry about before the sale, what do you have to worry about right away, and what should be on your radar for later.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, because it's an actual solution. I will tell you that I see very few clients doing this, but I highly recommend it. It's just, it's hard. And we talked a little bit about this. I mean, when you're doing a deal, cybersecurity and privacy still are of one of many issues, that you're working through. But I do believe wholeheartedly that this will become more best practices, over the years to come, for exactly what you just said. I mean, the pen testing not only helps to remediate potential real threats, immediate threats, but it also helps to understand how to transition in. So, I mean, it's really a twofold process to help with that integration, because that integration often is tough, at least in the beginning. So anyway, thank you. That's just a really useful suggestion.
Yeah, right. It'll sound like a broken record a bit, but I think that's again where kind of that strategic risk-based approach comes in, because of finding if that organization, pen test finding if that organization was staying on their own could be extremely critical. But for the buyer, they may choose to short-term accept that risk, because if they're blowing up the IT department and merging them all onto their systems, they may look at that risk completely differently than if that person was standing on their own. So, again, consideration there of looking at the scenario when you're looking at what those recommendations are.
Next slide. So yeah, and then this is another quickly growing topic is so many organizations, especially these startup organizations, are built around some kind of e-commerce offering or some other healthcare or something like that utility that they've put together that the buyer wants. And our application or the due diligence around application has a lot of different facets. One is, are the applications or websites they're running actually safe? Or is there, SQL injection vulnerabilities or something like that that could have led to or could lead to a breach that you have to be worried about? But even more so than that, like, what is the quality and value of the application we're buying? Is it vaporware? Or is it well structured and scalable? As Brad mentioned, does it have all the feature and functionality that has been committed to clients? Is it mature in that way? Or is it going to be a problem once you buy it and can't really keep it running? It's kind of slapped together to be sold and the seller wants to move on then.
Right. Yeah. Was it actually built with security in mind, right? Or was security potentially slapped on as an afterthought? How's it, segmenting sensitive data? How's it protecting that data? Again, kind of even going back and combining this with the last slide, when we look at the type of attacks that we see, and even the way we're carrying out our own attacks on our customers from our pen testing practice, it's very different than it used to be. And the bulk of it is really attacking for application development. Back in the even 10 years ago, we were still looking at critical network patches as being and organizations missing those patches as being the key way into systems in a lot of our penetration tests. Now, we're really focused on exfiltrating data from organizations based on poor development. And that's what we're really looking at here is, okay, especially if you built this large application in-house and that intellectual property is what is being bought from you, does it live up to the hype, so to speak, of what you're thinking you're buying, and how is it going to be handled post-close is extremely important. How is it supported and secured?
Yeah. And this is another one of those areas where, again, the buyers are typically larger organizations that have been doing their thing their way for a long time. And the sellers are typically startups that are using the cutting edge development methodologies, using cloud technologies and, virtualization technologies in creative ways. And it's hard for the buyers, like IT staff and development staff, to know, again, is what they're doing different, or is what they're doing wrong, or is what they're doing better? It's all they know at this point is it's different, and it's a bit complicated and confusing. And as part of the due diligence, we're definitely trying to work through a lot of that as well. Okay, you're using Amazon services, are they using them correctly? And these deployment tools, are they using those correctly? Just from the architecture to the execution and code management and all that kind of stuff. There's such a variety of different ways that organizations are approaching that nowadays. It's not an apples to apples comparison. You've got to really dive into each situation to understand, is it bad, is it good, or is it just different?
Yeah, and what are the quality of the developers? What has their training been? We actually provide secure development training as part of one of our offerings, and we'll give that to large organizations that bring us in and have us present and train and teach their developers. But small organizations can't afford that, or they don't have that. So again, it's trying to see what the mindset was when it was developed, and oftentimes we find that it's more about functionality and sales than it is about security. But of course, if you're the buyer of that application, you tend to care more about the security aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're seeing from the situation where the main thing they're buying is this e-commerce or healthcare application, and like I said, the development team really maybe has their act together and has all the latest and greatest tools and techniques. Um, and we've even in the recent weeks seen the other side of it where um, the buyer's purchasing a small manufacturer, and we're talking through some of the web services they have, and oh yeah, well this page, you click here and then the password for everybody is this, and yeah, this was built in Visual Basic by a former employee and we haven't changed it in 5 years. And so obviously that's a risk, but diving into what is that risk and what do you do about it, for like a 5-year-old Visual Basic application facing the internet. um, unique questions that all require a certain depth of technical knowledge and scrutiny to come up with the right answer. Next slide.
So I think this one is interesting in that it bears a lot of value, and part of it is actually not necessarily due diligence. Really the pre-signature forensic analysis is us looking at the organization for indicators of compromise. So we all talked earlier, both Jen and Kevin mentioned, buying a breach, right? And we've all been part of those deals, both with Sikich and Foley, where something happened pre-close. And I know we personally did expert testimony on a case where it was 6 months post-close, and they identified they were a financial processing entity, and identified that the iframe that they had been hacked and was redirecting information, to a false website, where the attacker was grabbing all of that data, but then it was still sending the transaction through to the proper entities as well, so nobody was the wiser. And that sat and did that had been doing that since pre-close. So all of a sudden, then you have all sort of rep and warranty clause issues from the contract, and there wasn't rep and warranty insurance in this case. So, the buyer was going back after the seller for a breach of warranty in the deal, because we were looking at saying, okay, well, this was there at the time of the deal, but it was increasingly hard to truly prove a lot of it, simply because you look at what most organizations, and this was a couple years ago at this point, keep for logs. The key to a lot of the IR work that we do is, what are your logging capabilities for an organization and how long are you keeping those logs? And that really gives us the pathway to be able to investigate it. So, looking at this pre-signature forensic analysis, we come in and say we're going to take images of key systems. Now, this is another one that can be pretty sensitive because the organization's giving us keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and we kind of haven't bought the goods yet, from the buyer standpoint. So, oftentimes you may get a little bit of pushback for doing this pre-signature, depending on the organization. But if we can get in there and we can actually take a snapshot of key systems and run it through our forensics tools and look for indicators of compromise, it can sometimes help avoid that, you're buying a breach type scenario. Then looking at the post-signature forensic acquisition, like I said, that's not necessarily due diligence, but it's really good what I'd consider CYA in a deal, and that we'll come in day of closing and then take full forensic images of key systems for the organization and store it in our forensics lab, locked up in a safe, and store it for usually a year. And it may do nothing. It may sit there, and after a year, we contact you and say, do you want us to destroy this data? Would you like it back? But essentially, what is happening there is we have snapshots on the day of close such that should something happen 6 months from now, we're able to go back and look at what those systems look like on the day of close and reference that and be able to have you have some legal recourse based on us finding that, with a forensic image, with a date stamp of when things were on that system and being able to pursue potential, litigation if necessary.
Yeah, and then another optional part of it, kind of a deeper dive into disaster recovery, business continuity, incident response. A good part of that is just understanding what their maturity level is. Certainly on the BC and DR, it's also looking into are their backups correctly configured? Are they running? Are you gonna bring them on and have that assurance on day one, or are you at risk of if an event happens on day two, you're not prepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, those are the type of things that Jen mentioned earlier, where she helps organizations get things like that together quickly in 2 weeks before they're going to sell because they know they're going to get asked for it. We a lot of times see on our side that those same organizations that don't have somebody like Jen helping them are handing us templates they downloaded off the internet for a policy, just so they can say they have something to hand off. So that's part of what we're looking at too, right? Do you really have a policy? Have you really vetted it? Do you understand how your business continuity plan would even work if it needed to? All of those good things.
And not just, it's not just security too. It's now privacy as well, with compliance with California's privacy law or GDPR or other things there. It's it's a quick, frantic response when they get some due diligence questions. And, another thing, we look at too is asking for risk assessments, the most recent risk assessment and trying to analyze those gaps to get a quick picture. But most definitely, I would recommend to companies if they have any inclination that they may go through an acquisition and they are a target, is to try to get your ship in order before you go through the actual process.
Agreed. So, Allison, do you want to give one of the CE keywords?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. So again, if anyone is a licensed attorney on the call and they would be seeking CLE credit for today's program, please record the following CLE code on the attorney affirmation form. And I will resend a link for that form as well in the team chat box. But the first of two codes that we'll read today during the program is a combination of only letters, and that is the letter P as in Paul, the letter I as in India, the letter P as in Paul again, the letter N as in Nancy, and the letter B as in boy. So again, that first code is PIPNB as in boy. All right, thanks so much, Kevin and Brad. I'll give it back to you guys.
Okay. So yeah, then on the next slide. Yeah, so I touched a bit on integration analysis. We've touched on it a few times, but there's two key sides to this. One is that roadmap for merging the technologies together without increasing your security risk. A great example that I've talked about this, the big old corporation buying the new startup, direction from leadership. Don't change anything because we don't want to break what they're doing, but also bring them into the fold, make them feel part of the company. And how do you do that? And the buyer's IT is very concerned about, we can't take responsibility for these PCs because they're not part of our domain and we don't know much about the security controls. In that situation, we work together with them to put together kind of a scenario, an architecture where basically on day one, all of the employees from the seller company got accounts on the domain, got mailboxes on the buyer's environment, and would get access to the buyer's internal network through virtual desktops with with multi-factor authentication. So all those employees on day one, after the sale, they kept their laptop, they kept their current processes, but they had this virtual desktop to go be part of the new company where they could go to the intranet, go fill out HR forms, get to email through the new company. But, you know, at that point, they're part of the company, but they haven't put that company's environment at risk. And then it gave the buyer that time to say, okay, now there's a few things we need to fix this first week because they were higher risks. And then over the next 2 months, we're going to slowly roll out our standard laptop build to each group of these employees. So first, we're going to go to their accounting people because that's, a pretty straightforward thing to do. And we'll give them new laptops and work with them for a week to migrate off of their old laptops. And at that point, they're on the domain and all that kind of stuff. But a small stepping stone, one group at a time, and letting them focus on, okay, developers have special needs. Like, how do we accommodate those special needs for developers? At what point do we merge the seller's email into the buyer's email system? And a lot of these decisions aren't technology decisions, they're business decisions. When do the sellers start sending mail as the buying company instead of their old domain? And do they continue to use their old email addresses in any case? So we can help with the technology roadmap to support that. Again, working with the seller and the leadership there for their desires for that stuff to happen, but making sure that, in helping put together that roadmap, it's done with that minimal level of risk, but a reasonable level of risk. When we walk into those, a lot of times the IT staff of the buyer is like, yeah, we just need to replace other computers at day one. That's the only way we can do it. It's like, well, no, stop. Your organization's going to have some risk tolerance for letting them run as they're running today. We'll tell you what's okay. We'll tell you what's risky and fix that stuff right away, and give you that sense of a reasonable level of risk to accept to not interrupt their operations and make their transition as smooth as possible. Oh, Brad, you might be muted. Oh, let's go back a slide because we were still on that one. I just meant Brad is muted. And the other big part there is maintaining certifications as part of that post-integration. So we had one recently, as Brad mentioned, where the seller had ISO and HITRUST certifications that the buyer didn't. And so, the first question the buyer has was, well, once we buy them, are we now certified? And the obvious answer is no, it doesn't work that way. You can't just buy a certification. But the next question, the more important one is, do we break their certification, or how do we start integrating them without breaking their certification? And in that situation, again, we worked out a very detailed integration roadmap that said, okay, here's the few things you'll change immediately after the sale, but then you're not going to change anything else for the next 3 months while they work through completing their annual recertification process. So you don't interrupt that recertification process. And then the day that recertification process is done, now you can start merging them in, replacing their antivirus with your antivirus, replacing their management tools and all that kind of stuff with your policies and procedures. But, mapping out to do it in such a way that the new way of doing things is at least as good as the old way of doing things, and everything's documented correctly. So the following year, when you come back for that next HITRUST or ISO recertification, all your controls are still and applicable control is still in place that'll meet the requirement. There's documentation and audit trails showing that control or a control was in place throughout the entire period. Kind of how do you do that integration and make sure all your ducks are in a row for the next recertification cycle?
What I was mentioning before too, when you were talking about the risk tolerance, I think it's good to note that, if anybody on the call works for an organization that's really active in M&A, that, the risk assessment that you're doing for your organizations should include some components of, you know, how your risk tolerance and procedures are affected for, you know, an acquisition of some type, because it definitely stretches your standard, you know, risk policies and risk definitions that you'd use internally, and kind of forces you to step outside your comfort zone a little bit. So the more you can plan for that ahead of time, you know, the easier it is when, you know, the actual incident or actual, you know, thought process of working through it during a transaction occurs.
All right, next slide.
So I think we've harped on this a little bit already. This is, you know, actually our last slide. And again, it's, you know, as you've heard us talk about multiple times and looking at all of the best practices that, you know, we just went through. Again, not all of them are applicable for all types of deals. Not all of them are applicable for, you know, even the largest deal. It just, you have to take the approach of what are you looking at to get out of the due diligence? What does the organization do? What industries are they in? And, you know, again, coming back to that kind of risk-based approach for what you need to evaluate in order to feel comfortable moving forward with the deal. And, you know, having that proper kind of CYA in place, that you've done your due diligence throughout that process before you actually sign the papers and acquire the organization.
And I think that gets us to our next kind of, QA slide here.
Well, I have some Q&A. I think one size does not fit all. It's a good summary. I mean, you know, hopefully in the future, this will become more commonplace, and so that it'll just be a natural part, you know what I mean, of doing a deal and engaging that. But I do think not one size fits all. But with that said, every company almost in the world now is data driven, at least, if not a data company. And companies are consistently trying to figure out how to use data and assets. So they're collecting more and more of it, to whether they're doing AI or other methods of developing insights. So I don't see this stopping anytime soon, because we're just having more and more data ingested, you know, in the process. So I really want to just thank you all. I thought that was really fantastic. And, you know, hopefully we will get firms such as yours involved more and more in this process. But we just wanted to open it up to any other sort of questions. Feel free to turn on your cameras or not, and jump in and ask any questions.
Yeah, I know we had one in the chat earlier, Jen, that specifically was asking about how does a third-party financial institution protect themselves, you know, if they're financing the transaction for two other organizations that are responsible for the due diligence piece of that. And in my mind, that's almost a question for you, because it's going to be more contractual, I would think, based on the financial terms that they have with that organization.
I mean, most definitely. I mean, with that said, too, it's a pretty broad question. So, I mean, it depends on that particular deal, and where that financial institution, you know, it depends on what ownership or how they're doing funding, et cetera. It really will determine on that financing deal, you know, and where the risk bears to that financial institution. You know, especially on the buyer side, if they acquired a company and then had a mass breach that then would default on payment. I certainly think that it is in the best interest to get into the process, do you know what I mean, and understand the full picture of what that buyer is acquiring. I mean, we've seen it on the cyber insurance side even more. I mean, certain companies almost become uninsurable by the types of data that they end up maintaining. You know, it could potentially in the future lead to, you know, having issues with getting financing as well, not just based on the risk of the deal on other factors, but if it's too risky based on, you know, the entity that you want to acquire and what's coming in. So again, still an area of development. without really understanding that particular deal and the financing terms, we wouldn't be able to advise, exactly, but certainly a concern well worth looking into. Anybody else have any sort of questions? We're going to try to be in person, obviously, as soon as we can, but we also like the ability to get others, outside of the area. We usually host these meetings at Foley on the 40th floor. We have a beautifully renovated space that I can't wait to welcome you all to. We just don't know yet when, we would be doing that all in person, hopefully this fall, and we'll move our meetings back to that time. Does anybody else have a question just about M&A or due diligence or anything that is going on in the cyber or privacy space or locally here? I don't see anybody popping up. Any other new networking things? As always, we have additional agenda planned. We may even do some extra ones over the summer. We typically don't do them in the summer because of all of the activities that are going on. Although this summer there may not be as many large events over the summer. So we have additional events that are coming, and we will let you know. Does anybody else? I hear somebody in the background. If anyone else has anything to add.
Hey, Jen, can I pop in real quick?
Sure. Is that? Oh, hey, Matt. There you are. I did a nice introduction of you earlier. So wonderful. So glad that you're here. This is Matt Kruger, who I introduced earlier. Matt, would love to say, a few words about yourself. And I said how happy I am to have you here because you're actually handling an emergency matter while I'm on here. So please introduce yourself.
Great. I'm happy to do it. And you guys can tell me later what Jen really said about me. But for now, I did just want to say hi. I just concluded a couple months ago serving as the United States Attorney in the Eastern District of Wisconsin here. And so in that role, had the chance to interact with CSIPs, which is DOJ's computer crime and intellectual property section, as well as the FBI, which you all know puts a really substantial amount of its assets right now into investigating cybercrime, both for the concerns about risks to financial companies, healthcare companies, but also with the risks of economic espionage. And so I'm really thrilled to be here with Foley, with Jen, and I want to be just a service as companies face increasing risks. This is such a timely topic. And in particular, when there's questions of whether and when and how best to interact with law enforcement, I'm happy to be helpful in that regard. Or also looking at data privacy issues, as we're going to face increasing amounts of regulatory scrutiny. I think it's really wise to be taking preventative actions during a transaction, but then also as companies have issues, happy to work with you and with Jen and in this ever-changing world. So thanks for the chance to join you all.
Awesome. Glad you were able to pop in. Any other news or things to report? We are doing, a lot more as well, and I don't know if you're on, Earl or Aaron, in the St. Louis area. We're trying to evolve that market space, and some of the reason I think Earl jumped off, but we're really trying to stay Midwestern focused, at least for now, because some of the other cybersecurity initiatives in particular out west, have pretty, large groups already developed, but we're looking to expand in St. Louis. We do a lot of things down in the Illinois area, and we're also trying to work together with our Michigan kind of sister-like organization. So again, if anybody has any interest in helping us further develop those areas or has any other topic areas, please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you again so much for your time today. Allison will have a copy of the slides. They'll always be posted on the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. And we just wanted to say thank you so very much.